And you got two ways to do this, Zach, either the solid partner or just use advanced if you want to go.
Sure. And Thatcher, are we recording or?
We're live now.
We're live. Okay, great.
Go for it.
Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Thatcher with Kansas ASPA. I'll talk a little bit about the end about how you can join Kansas ASPA and the National ASPA chapter of the American Society for Public Administration. I want to thank everybody for coming today. Andrew Howell, Shawnee County Election Commissioner, Zach Mohr, who I'll let you introduce yourself and your position, and then thank Hannes for moderating this discussion today. So we're going to have I think an interesting and timely discussion on election administration, specifically in Kansas. So with that, Hannes.
Thanks, Thatcher. Thanks, Thatcher. Appreciate that, and appreciate everybody kind of seeing us online as well. Again, this is being sponsored by the Kansas chapter of the American Association of Public Administration, and hope you enjoy this, and hope you decide to join us as well, be one of our members. So this is really designed to try to stimulate conversation as well as encourage people to be part of our expanding organization here in Kansas. The topic today is election administration in Kansas, facts and fiction surrounding election administration in Kansas and the impact on democratic legitimacy. And we with us two great presenters. You heard them already, Zachary Mohr and Andrew Howell. We would like to have had Brian Caskey as well, of the Secretary of State's office, but I understand this is the last day for registration for the general election, so we may be busy administering to those important duties. First of all, I want to introduce both speakers here, and then we'll have them take about 10 minutes to talk about the topic from their perspective, and then I have a set of some questions to go through as well, and then open it to the floor for questions also as we go through it. We will end, though, promptly at 1 o'clock in the issue of time management to make sure everybody can get back to their work in their offices. So we have, first of all, this afternoon, Dr. Zachary Mohr, Associate Professor with the KU School of Public Affairs and Administration. Dr. Mohr's research focuses on cost analysis and accounting practices in government, which includes examining the costs of administering elections in the United States. And we'll hear more about that in just a moment. His upcoming book project, The Cost of Democracy, looks at the cost of conducting elections in over 8,000 local jurisdictions around the country. A critical piece of his research includes policy, lab-style survey, and focus group experiments on topics related to budgeting and accounting. Before joining the SPA faculty, Dr. Mohr was an associate professor and served as the director of public opinion, learning, and sentiment, the POLS lab, a resource and survey and focus group experiments, does that kind of work in social sciences at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He's also credited as a certified government financial manager. Welcome, Zach. Appreciate being here. Next, we have Andrew Howell, Election Commissioner for Shawnee County, Kansas. Has been the Election Commissioner since 2012, over 10 years, and responsible for conducting and administering elections in Shawnee County. He was also a state representative for District 4 for about 10 years, and also police officer, I understand, in Fort Scott as well for several years, and also received a law enforcement training degree at Law Enforcement Training Center credentials, University of Kansas as well. So welcome, Andrew, as well. So with that, let's start out first of all with Zach and go through information you think would be appropriate for the topic, and then we'll turn it over to Andrew.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today and joining us online. When Hannes asked me to do this, I thought, okay, this is great. It's something that I know something about, and it'll give me good incentive to get to the analysis of the Kansas data for our book. And I do still know something about it. I haven't gotten to the Kansas analysis. So this will be a little bit more generic, if not as specific to Kansas as I was hoping. But I do think that election administration and the resources that we're devoting towards election administration are really important. And so I think my comments today are probably more just setting the stage for what I hope Andrew has to say. Now, let's just talk about some of the definitions and some of the numbers. The elections administration is really all of the activities that are done and required to conduct voting. This includes maintaining polling books, setting up polling places, maintaining the certified equipment, on and on and on. You would be better suited to saying what that usually is, but usually I'm the one that it knows the most about this, but you are the expert here about those activities. But in the bigger picture, there are over 8,000 local election jurisdictions in the United States. And so we are a federalist system that has very local, we conduct very local elections. So what that means is that it's very fragmented in a sense. This is the infrastructure of democracy, but there's a lot of jurisdictions. On average, we know that the counties spend about 1% of their budget on elections administration. So it's not very much by county standards, but since you have 8,000 election jurisdictions, we estimate that you spend on average, and this is not in presidential election years or general election years, but over all of them, we're spending about $2 billion a year just to conduct elections administration. This isn't what is spent in the election by the candidates themselves. This is just what it takes to get the equipment, staff, run the polling centers. So that seems like a big number, but what I want to talk about today is kind of the bigger issue of, well, is it, and is it sufficient? So the things that I would like to talk about in this talk today are some relevant issues of, do elections administrators really have the resources that they need? If they don't, where did those resources go? And then what are the effects of funding and underfunding? So this comes from an analysis of 4 states. This was some preliminary analysis that we did. It's now published in a political science journal. I was hoping to show you the Kansas numbers, but this will do as a proxy for now. These are real spending, and on average, the amount spent per election. And what I would draw your attention to is that spending on elections administration, at least in these 4 states, peaked in 2008. And then since then, in real dollar terms, you see the sort of decline in funding. And we looked at the effect of the economic recession on spending, and that gap between the budget and the actual, which is an indicator of fiscal stress. And what we find is that particularly in that lag after the recession, that's actually where local governments were struggling the most because of the housing crisis and whatnot. But it shows that the economy really is influencing how much we're spending on local elections administration, and it's declining when we probably actually need to see more real dollars being spent on elections administration. So where did that money go? Well, it's a pretty simple story, really. It's going to all the other competing priorities at the local government level. Here's a great quote from Wendy Noren, former Boone County clerk in Missouri. It's at that's that other school in Missouri that we don't talk about, but it's a great quote nonetheless. And we actually did some analysis on this, and we found that election spending, the counties were making, in North Carolina at least, were making spending trade-offs for education and public safety, things that are highly visible, but there's some reasons for that. But the important point is that it really is election funding is at the local level, And so that money goes to a lot of other priorities in the communities, even though political scientists ask, well, this should be the most important thing in our democracy. Why aren't we funding this adequately? Well, my answer is that there are other more immediate, more visible things, and so that's where the money goes. So then what are the effects of underfunding elections? I get asked this a lot. People ask me to talk about the funding of elections a lot. So I talk about a study that we did also in North Carolina, where we looked at both resources and we looked at the capacity of the elections administrator. And what we found is that the capacity of the elections administrator was actually more important than funding. But what I want to point out is that the money to have high capacity elections administrators comes from local governments mostly. And so if they're not paying enough, then it's hard to attract and retain high quality elections administrators. Elections administrators, at least in North Carolina, did not make very much money. You do probably manage a Quick Trip or a Pizza Hut for more money. But it's important to remember that elections administrators often don't do this because of the money. It's almost a patriotic duty. You know, I think you know, equipment often gets talked about in this thing. Equipment does lead to problems if you don't have good equipment, but there are funding for equipment. I think the bigger issue is a loss of human resource capacity, and you know, when we have been underfunding elections for you know, over a decade now, and then you have the problems of COVID and the election problems around elections that we're seeing, and I hope Andrew talks about. I think that is the bigger issue, and that's going to lead to problems if we drive out those good people that have the capacity. And so, to the degree that we can, as public administrators, we need to support them and elections. So some just general conclusions. Election before COVID, elections administration was really being stressed by lack of resources. But this new election administration, targeting and harassment just have been worse since 2020, and so they attacked the vulnerability of the elections. I think what can or should be done about this is still an unresolved issue, and it worries me.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I think I have a list of questions here that kind of your presentation stimulated, but let's go ahead and have Andrew talk about items as well. We'll go from there. Andrew?
Well, appreciate your comments. I gave you a couple other things to kind of mention. Just the numbers generally, at least in Shawnee County. We typically have about 700 election workers. In fact, we're doing training today for about half of those. So it takes a lot to recruit and find and get people willing to do that work. We're fortunate here. We've got a county commission that really pays attention to these budget issues. We're probably one of the better funded agencies in the state on a population basis. So I have nothing negative to say. I know the county councilor actually spends a lot of time in our office trying to make sure that we get the support we need, and that does make a difference. So yeah, having 700 people that you have to manage, and then, you know, remember these people are working a 14-hour day on election day. They get 3 hours to get trained, can't make any mistakes. It's a bet that no business person would ever make. I mean, it's stressful to train them, it's stressful to find them, it's stressful to get them to feel comfortable with all the 600 statutes they have to remember when they're checking people in and dealing with provisional ballots. So it's a process, and part of how I mitigate for that is try to get people who will agree to do it over the long term. and over a number of different experiences, and as they gain experience, they're more able, I think, to better understand processes. So that's part of our success, I think, is trying to keep people in the process. We have about 117,000 registered voters in Shawnee County, which is a historic high. I don't think it's, at least during my tenure and probably prior to that at some level, we've never had that many. So I think that's a good thing in one sense, that people are interested. I guess the other thing that you mentioned that is a concern, and I think our county's done a good job of trying to address it, is pay for people working in elections right now. It has to be significant because it's a lot of stress and it's a lot more, you know, the public thinks that we work 2 to 4 days a year. We work really hard those 2 to 4 days, and the rest of the time it's, you know, kick back and don't worry about it too much and wait for the next election to roll around. But the reality is, at least in Shawnee County, we have 264 different specific ballots that have to be proofed, and they can't be wrong. And that takes, with 40 to 50 names on a ballot, every one of them's got to be perfect. So that's thousands and thousands of verifications that have to occur, and we have to triple check it to make sure it's not incorrect. So setting up for an election is months at a time. The supply chain has created some additional stresses, making sure we have ballot paper ready to go on hand. We've tried to print our election manuals and found out that the printer didn't have paper to print our manuals. I mean, there's some additional stresses in the supply chain issues of late as well. So it takes about 4 years, because there are so many pieces to administering elections, between the registration database, the ballot database and the precincts, and then election workers. There are so many pieces to all that you have to manage and coordinate. You can't make a mistake. That it takes about 4 different elections: a presidential, 2 odd years, and then another, we call it the governor election. Every election is significantly different and has to be set up differently. So training people, all of the things to be coordinated and be set up, is also a pretty significant amount of effort. So in reality, when you lose a 4-year employee, it's a triple or quadruple loss, because you've now got to go through another 4 years of training people. We're fortunate in our office right now, we lost about half of our full-time employees at the end of 2020. But the people that we have are very good. They've learned a lot the last 1.5 to 2 years. We've got a lot of training in, so we're making good progress. But it truly is impossible to replace some of these people. If you have someone that's good at building ballots, that software is very technical and difficult, and you have to understand precincts, and you have to understand party law, and you have to understand ballot law, and you can't make mistakes, or the public immediately assumes that it was done on purpose. So the reality is, it's a big loss if you lose one of those people. I guess just some other points to consider. You know, I've had a number of requests for copies of ballots and copies of ballot images. It's my belief that Kansas law doesn't permit that. The ballot is supposed to be secret. You're not supposed to be handing out ballots. And so, in consultation with our county councilor, we rejected most of those requests. But I think it does point to the confidence that the public has. And I think it's important that people know that we care about it. As election administrators, I think our job is to make sure people know that we're paying attention, that we do care about it, and that we're following the law. So when I get those kinds of questions about how does your process work, how can we prove it, I invite people to take a tour of our office, and I invite people to sit down and talk about it, because I think it's important that they know we're taking their concerns seriously. I think they've, in many cases, heard things, probably don't fully know all of how we do things. So I take the time when I get those calls to either sit down in person or at least to make a phone call, because I think it's important that the public know that we care about it and that we're listening and that we're paying attention to the details. So on the security side, what I tell people, this is statutorily required and it's what we do. We have party balance in almost every process we do in the building. There's always people of 2 opposite parties in every part of the process. In Kansas on election day, if you go to a polling place, there will be at least 2 people, usually more than that, of opposite parties. That's statutory. And additionally, we do that in our office. I have a number of people of various parties in the office, partly for that reason. just to make sure that every process that we do that's critical or involves ballots or ballot transfers, that we have those documented processes. We have cameras throughout the building. We have written procedures and processes. All of the election equipment itself is required to be documented as to who touches it, and whatever they do is documented. Additionally, it's all, like I said, under camera. There are passwords on all the equipment. The equipment itself, every one of the pieces of equipment has keystroke logging capability, so if there's ever a question, we know who logged in and what they did on it when they were in there. So I think there's a lot more security in place than probably people fully appreciate. So I spend time trying to explain that to people because I think it's very important. Again, I could go on and on and on. I'll talk about a couple other things. Like I said, we have paper ballots in Shawnee County. I think that's important for people to know, because at the end of the day, not only do we have an electronic record of what was happening on election day or throughout the processes, but we have the actual paper. And if we ever needed to, what I tell people here is we could, impanel a Republican and Democrat team to do exactly what we did in the recent recount, where you actually go through every piece of paper and verify that what we said on election night is what was actually occurring. Let's see. So I guess at the end of the day, when it comes to people's questions about elections, I just think it's important to be transparent, have the conversation with them, and invite them in to look at the processes. Because I think when you don't know the people and you don't know the processes, I think I used to, at one point before I was in elections, I used to have questions, significant question marks about really how it works. So I just think it's powerful, especially at the local level, if you can invite people in and be transparent about it. I think that's a quick synopsis of kind of what I see as the landscape. Just a lot of challenges across a lot of fronts. I know a lot of election offices struggle very much getting their elected officials to understand that it takes good pay for the people to work there. It's a lot more stress than you can imagine, and it's probably more so now than it's ever been. So it certainly hasn't gone down. I don't know where I'm at on my time, but
you're doing great. You're doing great. Super. Thank you for that. So several questions have come. Let me start with just kind of some clarifying stuff, if I can. Early on with Zach here. First of all, just the numbers, 8,000 voting jurisdictions. I know there's over 3,000 counties in the state, in the country. There must be a lot of cities that do elections. Give me some clarity about that.
Yeah, so most of the states you do county elections, as we know. But a significant number in the East, and particularly the Northeast and Upper Midwest, do it with townships or towns and townships. And so a state like Michigan has over 1,600 election jurisdictions. Wow. And that's not even precincts, that's individual, they're responsible for reporting the results, and so Michigan has over 1,600.
That's amazing. That gives me some clarity. I did not know that. That adds to my body of knowledge.
This is why I wanted to present the numbers. Because I don't think people understand it, right? Like, I don't think people understand how complex it is.
Yeah, and that provides a great, to tell you that at least for me anyway, that the authority, if you will, and the importance of that local jurisdiction holding those elections is a benefit in terms of the locale that runs it, but it also requires that the training has to occur in the human capacity, really has to be there to make sure it's done correctly. That's my impression. Gotcha. So the second thing that strikes me, minutiae detail to a degree, but funding, I get it is the $2 billion, but I have been hearing that the federal government's been putting in a lot of money as well. Is that part of your factor for the $2 billion? Does that include federal money, or is that all local money?
So our analysis uses dollar figures that go up to 2016, 2017 was the last fiscal year. So that does not account for rises in spending in 2020 particularly. But it's important, and I want people to realize that Number one, the federal government historically has not funded elections, and so it was only with HAVA, post-Bush Gore.
HAVA means?
The Help America Vote Act, that the federal government has stepped in at all in this way. Yes, they did in 2018 spend some more money on election security, and then in 2020 with COVID. But we were talking about this earlier. The federal government only made $350 million available. There were strings attached, so they didn't actually spend all that money. So the private sector actually had to step in, and so private actors like Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Center for Tech and Civic Life stepped in and provided a lot of grants to local governments. So we would expect funding to have risen in 2020 significantly, but there was additional need in 2020. So yeah, but it's important to realize these numbers just good.
So thank you, let's get that clarification there as far as that is concerned. Let me go back and ask you both this question. What are some of the most outrageous, fictitious claims about our current election process that you've heard? The most outrageous, fictitious claims.
Take this.
Well, I think the big one, and I think people need to know that we're paying very close attention and taking the question marks seriously. So what I've told people is when they ask about how do you know that satellite hasn't, pushed data up and changed numbers and changed ballots and changed totals, it's very difficult, first of all, to prove a negative. I don't know if it happened or not, but at some level I tell people I don't really care if it happened in one sense, because that's really not the critical question. The critical question is, do you really believe anybody can change an actual ballot inside the machine itself where it's setting? And then additionally, like I said, we have multiple ways to verify that they're correct, and the pre-test and the post-test of elections demonstrate whether it's correct or not, as well as the fact that we do an audit now required by law in Kansas. So we're actually looking at physical ballots, making sure that the numbers that we gave people are in fact correct. That's probably the biggest one. And then I also assure people that, at least in Shawnee County, I can't speak to other areas, that we know from multiple sources that there are no modems in our equipment. So I think people latch onto that and wonder. I think what does occur is there are other states that do use modems to transfer the final results back to the office. So I think people maybe see that occurs in other jurisdictions, assume maybe it happens here, but I offer to show people, here's how it works. If it had it, it would have an antenna. Ours don't have that, so again, that's probably the biggest single one that I think is out there a little bit, at least for here.
I got you. I was impressed by, if you haven't done it, for those in the audience and those online, I would encourage you to go to the Secretary of State's website and pull up what's called Did You Know, which has a whole list of questions and answers. And one of the things that I found interesting in that list of questions is, I guess, state statute prohibits election machines to be connected to the internet. So that isn't codified to go ahead and make that work. And having been a polling place captain, going through the training and so forth, which I found if you've not done it, I'd encourage you all to become election worker. And I actually encourage our department heads in Johnson County to do exactly that, because you can get in. First of all, I think that's our civic duty as public administrators to understand the election process and support it. But secondarily, give us the background of what's going on. The transfer of that information vis-a-vis the flash drive and the chain of custody, at least in Johnson County, was formidable, at least in my viewpoint from that point. So I get it. So that being the most egregious. Thank you for that. What have you been hearing exactly? What egregious?
Well, I want to talk one thing about the modem issue is that in all jurisdictions they're going to have an air gap backup at least. So even if they transfer the results via modem, the internet, like we all do, but they're always going to have that air gap backup, just so that, and like you said, there's going to be a chain of custody to make sure that you can't change the results, or at least if it was changed, you could go back and see the results. So at least everyone that I'm aware of. So you talked about the policies and procedures that are in this. I mean, it's just mind-numbing how much there is to it. And then you put on top of it the partisan, watching from both sides, the partisan balance. I think that's the issue that most people don't understand, is how closely this is watched by both sides. And these numbers are really, really accurate. At the same time, there are human factors in all of this, and so mistakes can and do happen. This isn't the most egregious, but I'm going to tell a personal story, just because it was meaningful to me. Right before the 2020 election, we were having a local ASPA meeting at Charlotte, the Central Piedmont ASPA. And we brought in the elections director to give a talk just like this and tell us everything that happened. And wouldn't you know, like the day or 2 days before, their office had made a mistake. They sent out 2 ballots to a small section of the city, and so it was a mistake. It was during COVID, and they were only having part of their staff come in at a time, and one of them, sent out the ballots, but forgot to mark that they did it, and then they sent out more ballots. And he said, but there's procedures in place for seeing that those that got sent out, when they get sent back, if we've gotten a ballot from that person at that house, we won't count the second one. So we know how to do this. We can take care of this. But literally that day, former President Trump sends out a tweet blowing up Charlotte Mecklenburg elections office for trying to rig the election, and saying that what they were doing was basically fraud. I've always wondered about that instance, because immediately the media contacts us in political science, and luckily we had heard about that just that day, and so we refused to comment. We said, they have their procedures, they know what they're doing, they can take care of it. They refused to put that on the air, of course. They made a big deal about it, but it could have been worse. I think if we wouldn't have known about all of those things. So I like your thank you for coming and talking to us about this, and thank you for reaching out to people and letting them know about all of these things, because it's really, really important.
Well, that kind of spurs up another question. I'll open it up for people in the audience here. I've got other lists, but I want to hear your comments also in the audience here. The question again is, what impact do these fictitious claims have on the legitimacy of our democracy, i.e. the trust that our elected officials that they have the actual authority to make binding decisions regarding our government? What does it do? What are these issues about Trump and so forth, these kind of constantly turning the issue, what does it do to verifying or eroding the legitimacy of our elected officials in our government?
Well, I think anytime you have question marks about how things are done, it's certainly not helpful. I think it does erode trust, and it creates, anytime you have information that's not correct, it certainly creates question marks. And I'm kind of a big fan, like I said, of anytime I get a chance to talk to somebody who has questions, about trying to put those questions to rest to the extent possible. It can be difficult to do. If it's widespread enough, that can be tough. But I think at the end of the day, especially in smaller jurisdictions, it comes back to, do people trust you in doing your job? Do people understand that, hey, there may be information that's not entirely correct, but at the end of the day, we still trust the officials we've elected, or not? I mean, I think at some level, I guess I would hope that our elected officials have enough confidence of the public that they can overcome some of the temporary question marks until they can get maybe to better information, more accurate information, or a better public understanding.
I mean, from an academic standpoint, what we know is that people's perceptions of how elections are run are directly correlated with their views on democracy. So if you think about it, a lot of people's only interaction with government may be when they vote, and so or pay their taxes, and they don't like paying taxes. So probably the best thing that we can do is have good elections to give them faith in their democracy.
Yeah, tough work that way, Zacharias. Yes, go ahead.
So you alluded to this a little bit, but I think this upcoming election is even more unique than the last election, which is hard to believe, but there are some people who are running for office who are openly talking about, yeah, I'll accept a result if I win, but so they're alluding to the fact that they may not accept a result if they don't win. So how much harder do you see, even if it's not in your jurisdiction, do you see that impacting your job, or do you see that impacting your job potentially after this November election?
That's a little tough for me to answer, because I feel like here we've really worked hard at building a reputation of paying attention to details and doing a good job, and so I don't sense a lot of that sentiment here. I think if you have enough of it across the country, it could certainly make things difficult. You may get a lot more recounts, you may get a lot more legal action. So yeah, it can certainly, over time, if you have a lot of that going on, it can certainly create additional costs and question marks in the public's mind, for sure.
From an academic standpoint, I know you study this, do you see this being, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what happens after November 8th, right? What people's response are to election results. Do you have any opinions on what you think this is going to look like?
Yeah, so, I mean, I hear what you're saying about, you know, you have worked a lot with the public, but I'm reminded of a story that I heard from a North Carolina elections administrator after their primaries, and I don't think we had the problems with the primaries here that we saw in other places, and I'm wondering if we're going to have more problems this time around. But in North Carolina, there were a lot of election deniers, and one of the counties that was a very, very conservative western North Carolina county. I think she said that they didn't even have any Democrats on their ballot. It was that conservative. And so she thought, there's going to be no problems. Like, what do they have to argue with? And somebody came in and was throwing a fit and wanting to see inside the machines, and no, sir, you can't do that. You can't, you know. And she said, sir, you're going to have to. We're going to call the police, and you're going to go to jail for this. Are you ready for that? And he said, yes. Call the high sheriff. And of course, they called the sheriff. This is the county, and the sheriff said, I refuse to come out there. I want to know I want to know the answers to that too. And so I'm worried about this type of small town inner fighting. It could give people a terrible impression, and you know we haven't seen a lot of it in Kansas, but there certainly is the potential for it.
Excellent point.
Well, the chart reflected that, I guess, the peak costs of running an election were in 2008. Did I read that correctly? I guess the first part of my question is, do we think we're approaching the peak cost of an election again? I mean, with potentially an imminent recession, and you know the housing market kind of approaching where it was in 2008. Do we think the cost is approaching that peak again, and then combine that with, you know, I think record voter turnout in the last election? I mean, if that trends upward, how do you budget for that? How do you plan for that? And when it hits that peak, how do we avoid the quality of the election going down?
I think there's a couple of pieces to that. One, you know, in 2016, Shawnee County went out for bid. I was actually part of putting together a statewide bid because we were trying to make sure we were paying as little as possible and getting as much as possible. So a number of large counties went together and did kind of a joint bid process. So in 16, we purchased our equipment. So I guess I would segregate it into a couple of pieces. Your equipment cost is significant, so that's kind of the hard cost that's fairly substantial. We're hoping that that purchase lasts 15 years. I don't know if it'll only make it 12 or if it'll make it 20. So, you know, by 2024 to 26, we're going to start looking at that again. We were early in the process compared to most of the counties in Kansas, as probably as well as national. So I think most jurisdictions have purchased equipment by now, I would guess, and probably have another 5 to 10 years to go before the equipment piece picks up. The ongoing cost that's substantial, though, again, is just wages for people so that you don't have to keep retraining and keep trying to get that knowledge base up there. That is a fairly constant, along with all of the contracts for service on the equipment, for delivering equipment to polling places, those kinds of things. Fairly constant, and it's certainly going up. You know, paper costs for printing ballots are going up. Contract costs for people to come out and do work on the equipment's going up. Employee costs, all that's going up. So in an inflationary environment, I don't know that I look for those costs to go down anytime soon, and I think that's probably where we're at. I don't know if I answered your question. I guess I was trying to split it into kind of an equipment and ongoing costs.
Yeah, I think that generally answers it, yeah.
The only thing I would add is that it is really actually very hard to get cost data on elections administration. And that's why our data only goes up to 2016 and 2017, because we had gotten some grants from MIT to do this work. Yeah, there are states where it's easier and more available. Kansas is actually relatively good. North Carolina is great. But yeah, we haven't looked up through 2020, and that's something we need to do.
If I may have a question, maybe kind of looking at the end of the process. So election day comes, the polls close, and maybe in this day and age of instant answers, we start looking at, okay, when's Shawnee County gonna turn in the results? You know, who won? What's the vote? And so I guess the longer it takes, maybe you're going through all the steps to make sure that integrity piece is there and everything's following all the procedures. But if that gap between when the polls close and when you're able to report results, does that cause, I guess, some people to wonder, hey, the polls closed and it's been, 10 hours and we don't have any vote count from Shawnee County, so what's going on there? Or
No, I think all of how you report the results matters to people and can either enhance confidence or not. I think the challenge is, one year we had an election worker, and again, good person, didn't mean anything, forgot to bring in the results media stick from one of the machines. And of course, I wouldn't let us close it out and call it a night until I had it in hand and it was plugged in and it was perfectly accounted for. So again, that goes back to that conversation of it's a 14-hour day, you train them for 3 hours, they only do it twice a year. It's a bet that no business would take. They would not take that kind of bet and that kind of risk because they're hiring people to work for day after day after day who get used to doing it. So I guess hopefully the public, and they probably don't, doesn't understand that these election workers are doing great work, but occasionally they will forget a piece of the step, and that can cost an hour or two for sure. Additionally, I think in Kansas, people may not fully appreciate that when you drop your ballot at the polling place on election night, if you got a mail ballot that you didn't get in, I think 2017, I think they passed a law that said you could drop it at a polling place and it would still be brought to the election office. So when we get that ballot at about 8:30 after polls close at 7, there's no way for us to include that in the totals because that's a whole other bipartisan process. So there's always a number of ballots out there that get counted after election night. I think maybe people don't fully appreciate that. But you're right, I mean, we do the best that we can to balance two different things. One, making sure that our processes are precise so that we don't misreport something, but still get it out quickly enough that people don't question, like, okay, why is it taking so long? What are you doing over there? Those kinds of questions, I think, can certainly appear in people's minds.
Yeah. And in Kansas, so is that your call? I mean, that you won't report results until everything's in, or do you release, you know, here's the first,
I think
50% or the votes, you know, or whatever, you know, 50% of the polling places.
Statutorily, we're not required to report everything, like it just takes however long it takes according to statute.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if you're sitting on a precinct and not reporting it, you'd probably better be out to the press talking about it immediately, which is what I did. As soon as I knew we were going to be an extra hour, hour and a half, I went to the press and said, we're waiting on something. We expect it to show up soon, that someone has to get back into that location. It's now locked. They have to get what they should have brought the first time back, and then it has to get plugged into the final results computer. So, you know, it's an imperfect process. A lot of the way we do it is designed to do two things: be good enough and save money, but it's complex and there's a lot to it, and it's done with volunteers who aren't perfect, who don't know everything. So I guess the only answer I know is to talk about it and say it like it is, and try to be as transparent as you can about what's going on.
So do we think, is there a silver lining in all this attention on the election process, that maybe by the end of the day, because of all the extra attention, extra effort, extra equipment, whatever it may be, that the integrity of the election process is better maybe than it was?
That's part of the argument I've taken, if you're asking me. I specifically have told people, I think in a way it's an opportunity to talk about the processes and talk about the law and talk about why we do the things we do, and hopefully over time people are like, okay, that makes sense. I do think there is a little bit of a, you know, a lot like you hear about people vote for the congressman because he's fine, but it's all the others I have questions about. I think sometimes it's that way in elections. That, well, we think our local elections are fine, but I'm worried about all the other states and how they do it. I do think there's a little bit of that out there.
We've got about maybe 10 or 12 minutes left. Time flies, we're having fun, which is great. I guess the question I had is there, and looking through the information from the state and others, the amount of security involved in elections is formidable, both during the election process as well as registering to vote, and then also making sure the actual person shows their voter ID and so forth. So I guess general statistics, we got about 2.9 million people in Kansas. 1.9 million are registered voters, which is a good number. It's higher than I had thought from that point. Still 71% of registered voters actually voted in 2020, so there's a percentage that registered that don't vote. My question is, in what ways have the current voting processes, voter ID, restrictions on carrying ballots, etc., had an impact on eligible voters casting their ballot? Have we seen any sort of impact on this stuff?
I haven't personally seen it. I'm not going to say it hasn't happened, but you know, the law actually has quite a few options. You can use a military ID, you can use your passport, you can use a Kansas ID or a Kansas driver's license. I mean, there's a number you can use. If you work at a school district or a KU, you can use your KU badge. So there's a lot of options to prove, and really the point of that law, I believe, is just a photo verification that it really is you that's attached to that name in the poll book. I haven't seen that, at least not here.
Any comments back on that?
You know, I think that that the photo ID is probably less of an issue, and like you mentioned. I do think that you know, the different forms of casting a ballot that happened during 2020 really helped people to vote in some new ways, either mail ballots or drop boxes. That it helped, and we should be encouraging these sorts of avenues for voting, because they help. And I remember what Michael Dickerson at Mecklenburg County has always said is he liked the mail-in ballots because it allowed him to, you know, process some in advance, and it wasn't all on election day. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, the larger the county is, typically the more the administrator likes at least part of what a mail ballot brings to the table. I don't push any particular form of voting. What I always say to people is you have 3 ways to vote. Under the law, you can vote by mail, you can do the 2 weeks before election day. If you're not sure what your schedule's like, I recommend that one. But again, or if mail works for you, use it. But mail 2 weeks before the early voting at the office as well as election day. But typically in larger jurisdictions, the one thing that mail ballot processing early does bring to the table is it helps to relieve the crush of things that have to be done when you're counting thousands and thousands and thousands of ballots and all the issues around that. Sometimes it is easier to get those things handled earlier because a lot of those you can process before election day.
Well, looking at statistics here recently, the number of folks who are using mail ballots and in-person advance voting is going up substantially. I mean, those are the polls are in-person voting on election day or less. What are the implications for that in terms of the resources you are going to devote for those election processes if that continues?
It's probably one of the bigger questions in budgeting, quite frankly, is trying to accurately predict how much of a mail budget you need, how much of an early voting staffing you need, and then how much you're getting election day. Those are constantly juggling of where do you put the resources, and you really kind of have to guess and not be wrong. Because what you don't want to happen is election day not to have enough ballots out at the polling place or not to have enough ballots at the early voting site.
Yeah.
So it gets to be a constant juggling act trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I can see that.
Drop
Yes.
boxes? I'm sorry,
Oh, sorry. I was just curious if either of you thought the public trust factor is somewhat of a hindrance to any innovation in some of the administration processes, or do you think there will always be a human element in administrating election?
From my perspective, the trust factor is hindering the advancement of election administration.
Well, it certainly takes a lot of time. I mean, we have a lot to do, and I've spent a decent amount of time talking to people, sending emails. So it certainly can be a legal drain on a county as well as just a time drain. I just think it's the space we operate in, so I just try to put as much effort into having the conversations as I can. I also know some counties simply don't have that. They have too much to do and really can't do it. So I understand that argument and that problem. I don't think that election administration is something you can build an app for. I don't think it's something that you can turn AI onto and have people trust it. I think you will probably always have to have people heavily involved in it. Don't think there's any danger just yet of AI taking over and the job not being here.
You're still going to have a job tomorrow.
I think so.
I think so too.
Well, that brings up, I guess, another question here. What do you think is the future of elections coming up in terms of either administration or litigation or legislation, restrictions, more or less? What does the future look like here? Let's take the next 5 years.
I think it's going to continue to be a hotly debated legislative issue, and there will be arguments made on multiple sides of all the conversation. I do think, and I think in Kansas we've done a good job, but I do think elected administrators have to be involved in the conversation at the legislature because, like I said, 600 statutes, no legislator's going to know them all. I don't know them all. I've read them all.
Yeah.
I try to remember them all.
Yeah.
I probably don't quite know all of them yet. So it's complex and there's a lot to it. So I think my cautionary tale to legislators would probably be don't rush into big mass changes because there's a lot of unintended consequences that can happen.
Agreed. I think that it's going to continue to be a hot social issue, at least in the near term, legal issue as well. And this issue of who finances elections administration may continue to be something that we talk about as counties or local governments are stretched, and so that might be something that we can talk about as well.
Any other questions from the audience here? Yes.
You mentioned like personally talking to people that have questions and maybe taking them through the office and showing them how it's done. Is that like a proactive way to get public engagement and kind of build that trust with the elections office? And do you think that there are other initiatives elections offices could try and do to build that public trust and engage people in the process?
Yeah, I do think town halls, public meetings, I think all of that's good. My experience has been that one-on-one conversations probably do about as much good as a town hall in some ways, because you're already talking to people who are clearly concerned about something. If they've written you an email, if they've got an open record request, if they just really want to talk about something, I really focus on those folks because they've read something, they've heard something, they've got question marks in their mind about something. So at least in the last 6 months, my focus has been on spending time talking to them, or at least trying to address some portion of whatever their question mark is.
Anything you would add to that, Zach?
Yeah, no, conspiracy theories, what we know about them is that people's belief in conspiracy theories generally goes down when they have more education.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that this is an area where we aren't particularly well educated about what are all the administration components of that. And so, to the degree that you can, you need to have that maybe one-on-one interaction, or maybe come to the ASPA meeting and hear somebody like yourself tell about everything that you do. But it is amazingly powerful to go into an elections office on elections day or around that time and see everything that goes into it, and see that that partisan balance that's real. There's always going to be people of both sides looking at just about everything you all do.
Well, and let me add to that. In that regard, people are welcome to come within about 5 days before Election Day. We invite the public. I actually put a press release out. We try to make sure everybody knows they're invited to come watch the testing of the equipment. It's a public event. Same thing after election. People are invited publicly, and we even jump on Facebook and do a quick clip just talking about it. So, I think that's important to let the public know they're invited to come see that here at any time, as well as, frankly, across the state. It's a legal requirement.
The time has just flown by here for us, so we're close to the end of our time here. I want to thank our two guests here, Zach Mohr and Andrew Howell, for I want to thank the audience also on Facebook Live to go ahead and watch us here. We are the Kansas chapter of ASPA. We encourage you to go and search us on Facebook or other means to go ahead and kind of join our happy clan of people who are involved in doing the greater good on behalf of the public. And we'll have more activities in the future. But Thatcher, anything else you want to go and say to our audience before we adjourn this particular presentation?
Yeah, I'll just close this out real quick. Thanks for everybody for coming. You can go to aspanet.org or Kansas ASPA on Facebook to learn more. I think we do a good job of uniting the public sector, the practitioners with the academic side, and we're able to have unique and interesting discussions like this. So look on Facebook for what we're going to be doing next year, and I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Andrew, and Zach, and Hannes for moderating today.
Thank you very much.
We'll see everybody next time.
Thank you very much. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Very much. Good comments, good stuff.
That's my question.
Yeah,
Education. It's like, how do you blast out